Three.
Hi, welcome to the New York Parrot Literary Corner. Today's guest is Kashiana Singh. She is a management professional by job classification and a work practitioner by personal preference. Kashiana's TEDx talk was dedicated to her life mantra of work as worship. Her poetry collection, Shelling Peanuts and Stringing Words, presents her voice as a participant and an observer. Her second chapbook, Crushed Anthills, is a collection of poems and photographs through which she unravels her journey through 10 cities. Her poems have been published on various platforms, including Poets Reading the News, Oddball Magazine, Cafe de Census, Turnpike Magazine, Dissonant Voice, Inverse Journal, Feminine Collective, and others. She's a regular voice on the Wednesday night poetry series run by Kai Coggin and is very proud to have been a featured poet for their Inauguration Day event. Kashiana lives in Chicago, is moving to North Carolina, and carries her various geographical homes within her poetry. She serves as a managing editor for Poets Reading the News and is working on her second full-length collection, Woman by the Door. Please welcome Kashiana Singh, and if there's anything in the that you'd like to mention about yourself that's not in the bio, please feel free. And thank you for joining us.
Hey, Dustin. Good evening. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. No, you've been really kind. I appreciate the kind words, and let's get started. Nothing else to say.
All right. Well, with that said, my first question is, your TED Talk. That was very interesting concept. Work as worship. Can you sort of elaborate on that for us?
Absolutely. I know I refer to the TED Talk, but I really try to embody that in my day-to-day, Dustin. And I think where I inherited or where I gleaned that from was growing up in all my years and what I saw around me, both from my direct parents as well as my extended family, in terms of treating work as worship. And generally speaking, they say, right, artist and writing, and how do you write while you're running a quote unquote, a typical work environment? To me, work isn't something different or separate. It's what you kind of immerse yourself in every day, and through that you get your inspiration, both for your creativity but also for your spiritual access. And that's really what I mean by work as worship. I have tried to embody that. It's hard to do it because living in the corporate world, which is where I do my day job outside of what I do for my soul, which is poetry, it sometimes is difficult to treat your day-to-day transactions as worship. And my goal is to find those tidbits of worship within the day-to-day transactions, whether dealing with clients, with team members, or with others at work as well.
So how do you recognize those moments? Is there a specific signal to you that that leads you to recognize that?
That's a great question, Dustin. I think and again, you get better. You think you get better at it, and then something pops up at you, which kind of throws you off gear, that you have to reinvent your recognition criteria. Generally speaking, and then I'll refer to this year that we just all lived together separately in a second, but generally speaking, the recognition happens, it's not an overt action. It's not like I walk in to the day and saying, oh, today I need to recognize moments of worship, right? It's the moments during the day that appeal to your innermost core in the best way. So as an example, and I say that in my TED Talk too, let's say that I'm speaking to a set of colleagues at work. The way that aligns to my worship aspect is looking away from what I need to do as part of my duty of coaching, training, developing them, to what I need to do for my soul, which is truly leading them down the path of getting better as professional selves, right? So I think the recognition happens when, just like for poetry, when something touches your core and your core beliefs and your principles. I know you write a lot from your core, Dustin.
Right.
That's one.
Of course.
That being said, I would say sometimes, and this last year was a test to that core being tested itself, right? Because all our dynamics and our paradigms and our North Pole and our South Poles kind of got shaken in terms of where they stood. So 2020 was a year of test for me as well, in terms of really finding those moments of worship while working. And one more thing I do want to say before I pause is, when I say work, and I know we are quoting the work as in the job work, but work is also what I do in the kitchen for my family, or what I do in terms of doing laundry, or what I do in terms of just taking care of my children. Everything is work in the broader sense of the term.
It's a very interpersonal and personal experience. When you're referring to work, it's we also in Christian in the Christian thought, there's the Protestant work ethic, and it's like you have your purposeful work, so that's it's very compatible with that idea. And I think also poetry, as you said, deals into your you go into your innermost core. And so I have an interesting question regarding poets reading the news. One, I find, for me personally, that writing on political and topical things is hard. It's difficult to do and still maintain a poetic balance. Do you find that that's difficult for you, and do you find that there are certain talents that are able to approach more topical matters with outstanding poetic capabilities?
That's a great question, and one that I've personally delved into, right, every day as I've kind of got associated with poets reading the news. Let me start by saying the very reason that I got attracted to this opportunity of supporting and partnering and being a part of the Poets Reading the News community was exactly because of this challenge that you just quoted, Dustin. Because I face it too, right? I am moved and shaken by so-called, quote unquote, political or topical events, but it often struggle as a poet myself to say, how do you keep the balance, just like you described. So from a personal perspective, it's helped me grow both as an individual as well as a poet, because reading other poets send in such impressive and impactful work on topical news items is extremely eye-opening, both in terms of just the connection of the topical to the inspiration, but also, Dustin, what's really been eye-opening personally for me is the use of poetry and literary techniques that people apply to their poems, even while writing on topical subjects, and the form that they use and the techniques that they use. So it is extreme. And so for me, it's been an education almost to be able to sit on the other side and be able to look at inputs that are coming in from different poets and learn how they glean the topical, but yet stay to the core of this, again, coming back to the word core, right? Stay to the core of the subject and to the core of what they want to do, and still be able to deliver something that's super creative and impactful from a poetic content perspective. So yes, personally, it's hard to, in my role as what I'm playing on the other side of the event, so to say, has helped me learn a lot just by reading how people approach it and approach the subject.
Do you find that people can actually be educated on a specific topic, reading various takes poetically, and you see a lot of point of view, people with contrasting points of view, as well as different subjects that align with each other?
I strongly feel yes. I think the way to approach the subject, whether we go back into 2020 and talk about the pandemic, or we talk about the political events and the turn that they took or did not take, whether we talk of the latest Asian-American influences into poetry that are happening in the current state of affairs, or we talk about the George Floyd period that we had last year. All of those periods, I can tell you, that reading the variety of themes, which were not always one directional, right? They were all multi-dimensional in terms of the approach they came to the table with. And to me, it was, I think, extremely educational to have them out there, to have different points of view, but also just probably points of view that one would never look at if we were just to look at it from a news item, from a news lens perspective.
It
So
has
for
a more
both of those reasons.
subjective, I think. There's the
Yes.
poems are definitely more subjective and more personal than a news
Right.
article on the same subject. And it also can be, for some people, I think reading a poem would be a lot more validating to them, especially if it was a point of view that they could easily adapt or look at from that perspective.
Yeah. And to me, yes, agree. And it's almost like you take a subject, and as you read the poems, it's like peeling the layers of an onion, Dustin, right? You're almost like peeling the layer of that topic till you get to the kernel of that topic, and doing that through these variety of angles and poems has, again, to go back personally, this journey with Poets Reading the News has been extremely educational, but also going back to my work as worship topic, it's been humbling to see the points of view that come to the table in the form of poetry.
Do you ever see that in this, on the Poets Reading the News, does there ever poetic conversations being had between poets writing on a subject? Did you find any particular subject that was really invigorating for poets to write about?
Two that actually the last year, again, we all know that we've not stopped receiving pandemic related or coronavirus related poems, right, whether it's related, and it's just, but if you read through them, Dustin, you will see that the tone has shifted from where it was in the month of March last year to today. It's shifted from lockdown to being inside, to being inward looking, to the current set of poems that are more outward looking about the vaccine and about what you can do differently, about vaccine equity in the world, right? So it's very interesting, even if you look at just the subject of the pandemic over the span of a year, how the poetic language has evolved over that period of time.
And again, it's very subjective, and so it shows how people are actually being affected by what's going on in the news and the media, as well as what's in the world, rather than just a sort of laundry list of events. It's a very conscious reaction to what's going on. I think that's a very interesting thing, sociologically speaking. I think it's very valid and interesting that poetry is a response to news, and I think it's a wonderful piece of work you're doing there with that.
I have a question regarding our performance, a regular show, especially the one has to do with the Wednesday night poetry series that is run by Kai Kogan. Can you tell us more about this? Do you still get involved in it, and how do they do that?
Yes, thank you for the question. I have a lot of passion and a lot of pride in how I got associated, and it's interesting, that show, and I won't speak for all of what Kai does. She's a gift to, and Dustin knows that, she's a gift to the community, to our community as writers. But it used to be an in-person event, and the pandemic made her shift it to something virtual. And it's beautiful in terms of how then it's evolved to something global. So it started by being local and in person, to being virtual and across the United States, to then starting to become global. And there are poets coming in each week from across the world, contributing their poems. What's real, and there are a lot of such, as we know, a lot of such live events that we have going on across the community. What keeps me grounded with this event in particular is the thematic approach that Kai takes and has taken all throughout this past year. So she throws out a theme each week. It's up to the corresponding poets to submit a poem on the theme or something that they think is close enough to the theme. So it creates a kind of a chorus, if I can use the word, right? Every week there's almost a chorus about a theme, which goes a long way in not just being another reading event, but almost creating this connection and community with each other. I've built friendships in that group over this past year since I started with them, which I've never met these people, but it feels like I have a connection, right? A different kind of a connection because we write about themes each week. And again, to go back to Dustin's point, there are different layers of the theme coming together each week through that reading. So it's really heartening. It's beautiful. And most of all, what I really treasure about it is the community that it's created and sustained.
In your bio presented by Dustin, it stated that you travel along with, you carry your various geographical homes within your poetry. How do you do that?
Wow, that's a tough question.
We like tough questions.
Yeah. Let me start by saying that first of all, right now, and I think I mentioned this to Dustin in my note yesterday, was I'm in the process of moving from Chicago to North Carolina. So right now I'm
Exactly.
actually in the process of carrying one home and building another new home. So you're hitting a real raw nerve and a very live point with me right now. Uh, but that being said, just two things. One, as growing up in India, which is where I spent most of my growing years, and I have traveled almost across the country of India, and that was part of my father's job. He was in the armed services and the police, so he would get transferred every couple of years. We would move city and location, so pack up baggage, house, home, schooling, friends, and move on to a new location probably every fourth year or so. So now we can look at it in two ways, right? Does that create displacement or does that create grounding? So the one way to look at it is it creates physical displacement, right? Because you're moving from one place to another. How I feel like it's helped me actually, and I realized it over the years, of course, initially not in the growing up years, but as I matured, is it's actually helped really ground me and give my roots extremely strong. And that feeds my poetic voice. It feeds my poetic voice because I get access to cultural aspects of these different cities that I've been in. And then, of course, I traveled abroad and then I came to the United States. So that was a huge move. And then now within the United States, I'm moving again. So that's another huge move. So to your question, it's a hard balance to balance the displacement and the grounding. And as an individual, I continuously remind myself to go lean towards the grounding aspect of each city and glean what I can from that to feed my poetry and to feed my personality and to feed my being, versus considering it a displacement and a loss. And that's as Dustin probably reads some of what I write, I mean, that
Yes.
shows up in my work as
As
well.
editor of Poets Reading News, how do poets read the news? I want to know how you came up with that.
Yeah, and I joined. This is a recent foray for me. I've been associated with Poets Reading the News probably now for around 6-ish months. I was writing for them. That's how I started my association with them. And then they had an opening and I applied and I got selected. And then I continued to stay on because, again, like we described earlier, it's a huge learning for me to be on the other side, both from an editorial perspective, but also from the connection of news and poetry perspective. So it was huge. Now, to your point about how poets read the news, it is amazing, right? It is
Indeed.
amazing to see, which generally the perception you would have is that poets are these isolated beings who kind of lock themselves up outside of the world, either because they get so influenced by the news, right, and they go into their own shell, or they are completely disconnected from the news. But what Poets Reading the News and the fact that it's all news related poetry that we read all the time, my realization has been that a poet at the core is actually the biggest change agent as well. So a poet comes to the news from the perspective of wanting to either drive change, whether it's consciously, subconsciously, overtly, or not overtly. But all my understanding of poets writing poetry around news and reading the news is from the perspective of wanting to enable change and drive things towards a positive direction.
I need further clarification on this. Do they write poetically, the news? I want to understand that aspect. Do poets read the news in poetic manner, or they just read news normally?
That's a tough question, right? I would say they read news normally, but they translate it into a poetic output, right? In terms of what's gleaned as meaning and the crystallization of what they read. I don't think poets read the news poetically. They read the news like you and I and every other person would read the news. But what's gleaned out of a poet's mind once they've read the news is what becomes poetic after that.
That means that I'm automatically a member because I'm into media and I'm also a poet.
Absolutely. Yes. Yes.
I didn't know there was a club for this. Where do I sign up?
Let's sign up for it.
We'll have to talk after the show to know how we can get in touch officially in that area, because this is what I do every day. I write news every day, I edit news every day, and I'm also into poetry every day, especially the literary world every day. So technically, you were on the same track, but
you're totally
operating on different levels.
You can ask Kashiana if she'd like to read a poem for us.
I would love to read a poem for you, Dustin. Do you have
just whatever you feel
anything?
the mood for? Yep. Yeah, just whatever mood you're in.
I'll probably read a couple, but I'll start with my first book, which is Shelling Peanuts and Stringing Words. And I will read a poem that's been one of my favorites in this book. I almost read it every time I do a reading. I try to read this one, so I'll do that here too, Dustin, if you give your permission. I'll just pull it up and I'll give you the background of it in a second. Just give me a moment.
Okay. You're watching the New York Parrot Literary Corner. Please subscribe to our channel. And we have Kashiana Singh today. She's going to read us a poem.
So this poem, it's called Mangroves. And the foundation of this poem, or the genesis of this poem, is, and Dustin, I know you're very familiar with the history of the subcontinent, but it's based in the subcontinent and the partition of India in 1947. Okay. So that's the genesis, and I'll leave it at that, and I'll come back at the end and maybe share more. So this is how the poem goes. Mangroves. Act 1. I set out once looking for mangroves with haunted stories about the withered woman with feet that turned inwards, the mangroves with secret spells hovering over lampposts, the mangroves where boys scuffled and where men gathered to grope for survival, the mangroves that displaced the rotten smell of burning flesh as each canopy collapsed into an Asian pile. Act 2. I waited. I waited to enter the looming arch of the house that echoed my mother's desires in entombed gold and treasures, the house that watched silent, the gates that creaked each howling ground, recollecting a plea, wretchedness of bruised bodies and naked shadows still lingering behind its walls. Act 3. I walked. I walked the platform again, chugging wheels that recited memories of trains moving like ghosts between places, transporting phantoms. The platform I walked again covered me in suit of butchered history. I lifted some soil, some scars, some sketches. Act 4. I opened the tall gates and entered against my will into the portico of my beginnings. I swaddled myself with the elegance of my mother, the industriousness of my father, the grit of my brothers, the sacrifice of my sisters, the flawlessness of their songs as they chanted, possessed to their dead and their crippled and their humiliated and their young and their newborn. Act 5. I bow in thankfulness and accept the warm tea served by the house lady on the veranda. Mangroves.
If I have to comment on this before you give us the background to this poem, it's a prose dramatic poem. It's metaphorical. The mangrove is not mangrove itself. For lay viewers watching this show, uh, I see that as a very unique approach to writing poem. It sounds like one of my short stories I wrote without a single verb, The Blotted Purple. So,
Okay.
what exactly inspired you to write this? It sounds like marriage or something, a kind of cultural thing that your family push you until you get to another people. What is it about?
This was, so like I said, this is based in the partition of India and Pakistan in 1947. That was one of the biggest incidents, right, in the country, in the world, even today, that's left displacement and intergenerational crisis.
Yes.
If I remember the numbers, there were almost like 2 million that died, 15 million were dispersed in that incident. My father and my father's family, my father was a young boy, probably 7 or 8 years, I don't know the exact age, but a young boy at that time when that happened, and his family was amongst those that were displaced from Pakistan to India. This was inspired when my father went back many, many years later. When I was a young adult, he went back to trace his roots, to go find the house that was left behind when the displacement happened. So this is really telling the story about his walking into that house, and it's from his thought process and his voice. Mutiu.
Impressive.
Would you like to read another poem for us?
Yeah, maybe I'll shift a little bit and take the next one from Crushed Anthills, and this kind of connects to the question you asked about cities and geographical homes and how I carry them inside me. Do you want me to read one of those, Dustin? I know
Yes.
you've read.
That was
You've
impressive.
read, and yep.
Sure.
So Crushed Anthills is my second. It's a chapbook. It's come out with Yavanica Press. I will pick. It's about 10 cities, like Dustin said earlier. I'll pick one city and speak to that one. I'm wondering whether I pick one. Let me read the one on Chicago. So there's a poem on Chicago in that. There's a lot of poems about cities in India that I lived in, and then there's also one on Chicago. Chicago. Your savage ambitions percolate the weather, your wind, your guns. You endure audible sighs of frozen ears, tattered by relentless chills. You know well, mothers of dead boys are not a pleasant sight. Whipping yourself into shape with each mistake, your flat-footed lakes separate people, their accents stuttering as they teach you not to fret about warmer climes. Chicago is pronounced she or she. The beers are the pride of the windy city, and I like to paint my own picture of you. Egging me on to places underneath gaping architecture, black balconies, gold-embossed towers, a cinematic history of burning and rising again. Sometimes you take me to my south side. I love you, except for the unlimited capacity you have for deep dish pizzas and road construction. Gripping me in a gray freeze, I come to scrape you into a familiar warmth. Chicago.
Thank you. That was Kashiana Singh with a wonderful poem. Maybe you could, we have about 6 minutes left. Maybe you could share some words you'd like to impart for our viewers across the world. Anything related to the arts or life that you want to share, how to persist, in your journey?
I would just maybe say one thing, and then you can tell me if we have more time for a poem, Dustin. But
Okay.
I'd like to present my thoughts that I really want to leave with is I'm a living I'm a living embodiment of somebody who comes from the outside, so to say, quote unquote, right? Outside, I'm a fusion of all my sensibilities and the geographies, to your question, that I carry inside myself. The language and the words that I bring to my poems come from all the places, right, that either I've been directly or indirectly been influenced by, and that's inherent to my poetic refrain. So I continuously focus and refocus towards a center of gravity. I cannot ignore my skin color. I cannot ignore my accent. I cannot ignore my Indian descent. But I come to all of that to think of these as enablers to my poetic output. I bring to my table, to my writing table, and I'm proud of it, probably a larger canvas than many poets can who do not have what I have, and a broader range of perspectives. And some days, most days, that's an advantage. Other days, it could be a burden. But I think what I want to leave with is the words of, I think it's Ada Limon's words, which says, all of us are like a collage. Let's accept ourselves as the collage that we are and bring that to the table every day, whether, again, going back, whether it's work as worship or whether it's poetry. And somehow the output starts to become more, A, become more productive, and B, become more sublime and meaningful, rather than leaning towards when the days or the places or the times when you're being different is more of a burden, right, than not a burden. So that's probably what I want to leave with, just knowing what we have going on around ourselves, Dustin, is how I approach that.
Excellent. People are collages. We embrace ourselves, and we move forward in life with optimism as much as possible, and try to embrace all aspects of ourselves and keep to that center of gravity. That's an excellent message. I think we maybe have time for you to read a poem if you can give it about maybe under 2 minutes.
Yep, let's try one. I'll try and pick a
While
short
you're
one.
while you're trying that, I've just I was thinking while you were presenting a poem about Chicago, and since you present something about India, Pakistan, Israel, so I will be waiting for you to also write a poem related to North Carolina where you moved there. Whether it's going to
Yeah,
be a year or two, I will definitely be waiting to read the poem.
I look forward to writing. I'll try and read a couple of. I've recently started to push myself towards writing haiku, Dustin, and
Okay.
it's a set of short poems, a short
Okay.
haiku set of haiku that I can read for you.
Sure.
And the set is called Normal, and it was written last year when nothing was really normal. So this is how it goes. Rare blue moon, another ambulance, and blue lights. Obituaries, age, color, caste, no bar. Tourist season, an empty colosseum of silent coffins. Shallow breaths, grandma whispers a final blessing. Cancelled flights, the godwit migrates again this year. Ocean waves, the dip and rise of economics.
Wow. Did you have those memorized?
No, I had it here in front of me.
Oh, okay. It looked like you were just pulling it off the top of your head. I was like, wow.
I have a couple memorized, but I had it up here in front of me.
Okay, I see. Yeah, and I love the way the nature, like the blue moon with the ambulance, the way you can sort of collide those together and make that into a poem. And I think that's one of the things poetry does best is work with analogies, and especially when they're revealing of life and the nature of things, and how these sort of coalesce with the analogy is
Yeah.
those were very beautiful. I love them. They're very
Thank
nice.
you. I'm still learning. Like I said, we are all learners. I know you consider yourself a learner as
Of
well.
course.
And haiku is, the purists in haiku would probably even dismiss these as not even being eligible to be a haiku, but that's where
Possibly.
they came from.
That was a structure, yeah, the American haiku. So this has been the New York Parrot Literary Corner. Subscribe to our channel, please do. It is a wonderful experience to learn more about the world and to learn more about poetry, to learn more about literature. And thank you, Kashiana Singh, for joining us today. We had an excellent talk. People were like collages, as you said. And I think we've learned a lot from this experience of listening in. And thank you to our watchers and listeners and viewers. Like I said, please subscribe to the channel. This is the New York Parrot Literary Corner, the only channel of its kind. Thank you.
Dustin, thank you. Bye. Take care.
You too.
Yeah.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.